Welcome to Top Stories Today. Please subscribe and then check notification box to get all breaking news alert. Breaking: Trump issuing death penalty to them all under new policy, Dems freaking out. In an unprecedented move this week, President Trump suggested using capital punishment for drug dealers in order to crack down on America's opioid epidemic. The president's comments came just a few days after it was reported that he had been praising Singapore's mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking offenses behind closed doors. Trump's senior aide, Kellyanne Conway, who runs anti-drug initiatives at the White House, was quoted as saying that Trump's position isn't one-size-fits-all kind of initiative. She went on to make it clear that the president isn't talking about your local marijuana dealer who sells a few dollars, but instead, he wants to go after the high-level dealers and kingpins, whose sales of millions of dollars of fentanyl translate to hundreds of casualties per week. Trump has also praised the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who has led a massive extrajudicial crackdown on drugs in his country that has left thousands of high-level drug dealers dead. Last year, Trump even went as far as contacting Duterte and told him he has done an unbelievable job on the drug problem. If this new way of combating the U.S. drug crisis goes into effect, this would be the first time drug dealing would be classified as a capital offense. Currently, the only drug dealers who qualify for the death penalty have been the ones which have been involved in the murder or death of a law enforcement officer. The president also made it clear he doesn't see a lenient approach to drug-related crimes as being something that should be tolerated, and isn't against the idea of implementing a campaign like Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign of the 1980s, where children were taught the dangers of drug abuse, along with teaching the fact that they will die if they abuse drugs. Via History.com, the Just Say No movement was one part of the U.S. government's effort to revisit and expand the war on drugs. As with most anti-drug initiatives, Just Say No, which became an American catchphrase in the 1980s, evoked both support and criticism from the public. The 80s crack epidemic. In the early 80s, a cheap, highly addictive form of cocaine known as crack was first developed. The popularity of crack led to an increase in the number of Americans who became addicted to cocaine. In 1985, the number of people who said they used cocaine on a routine basis increased from 4.2 million to 5.8 million. By 1987, crack was reportedly available in all but 4 states. Emergency room visits for cocaine-related incidents increased fourfold between 1984 and 1987. The crack epidemic particularly devastated African American communities. Crime and incarceration rates among this population soared during the 1980s. Reagan and the war on drugs. When President Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he vowed to crack down on substance abuse and reprioritized the war on drugs, which was originally initiated by President Richard Nixon in the early 1970s. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law allotted $1.7 billion to continue fighting the war on drugs, and established mandatory minimum prison sentences for specific drug offenses. During the Reagan years, prison penalties for drug crimes skyrocketed, and this trend continued for many years. In fact, the number of people incarcerated for non-violent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to more than 400,000 by 1997. Say no to drugs. President Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, launched the Just Say No campaign, which encouraged children to reject experimenting with or using drugs by simply saying the word no. The movement started in the early 1980s and continued for more than a decade. Nancy Reagan traveled the country to endorse the campaign, appearing on television news programs, talk shows and public service announcements. The First Lady also visited drug rehabilitation centers to promote Just Say No. Surveys suggest the campaign may have led to a spike in public concern over the country's drug problem. In 1985, the proportion of Americans who saw drug abuse as the nation's #1 problem was between 2% and 6%. In 1989, that number jumped to 64%. Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. In 1983, the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, Daryl Gates, and the Los Angeles Unified School District started the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. The program, which still exists today, pairs students with local police officers in an effort to reduce drug use, gang membership and violence. Students learn about the dangers of substance abuse and are required to take a pledge to stay away from drugs and gangs. Drug abuse resistance education has been implemented in about 75% of U.S. school districts. Despite the program's popularity, several studies have shown participating in drug abuse resistance education has little impact on future drug use. A study funded by the Department of Justice, which was released in 1994, revealed that partaking in drug abuse resistance education led to only short-term reductions in the use of tobacco, but had no impact on alcohol or marijuana use. In 2001, the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. David Satcher, put drug abuse resistance education in the category of ineffective primary prevention programs. Proponents of drug abuse resistance education have called some of the studies flawed, and say surveys and personal accounts revealed that the program does in fact have a positive effect on future drug use. In recent years, drug abuse resistance education has adopted a new hands-on curriculum, which advocates believe is showing better results than more outdated approaches to curbing drug abuse. Support and criticism for the anti-drug war. Determining whether the war on drugs movement was a success or failure depends on whom you ask. Supporters of the strict drug initiative say the measures reduced crime, increased public awareness, and lowered rates of substance abuse. Some research does, in fact, suggest that some aspects of the tough policies may have worked. A study sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services revealed that in 1999, 14.8 million Americans used illicit drugs. In 1979, there were 25 million users. However, critics say the 1980s version of the war on drugs put too much emphasis on deterrence tactics, and not enough focus on drug treatment and substance abuse programs. Another common criticism is that the laws led to mass incarceration for nonviolent crimes. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, more than 2.3 million people are currently being held in the American criminal justice system. Nearly 500,000 people are locked up because of a drug offense. Many people also felt the Reagan-era policies unfairly targeted minorities. Part of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act included a heftier penalty, known as the 100-to-1 sentencing ratio, for the same amount of crack cocaine as powdered cocaine. For example, a minimum penalty of 5 years was given for 5 grams of crack cocaine or 500 grams of powdered cocaine. Minority communities were more heavily policed and targeted, leading to a disproportionate rate of criminalization. But the Fair Sentencing Act, which was passed by Congress in 2010, reduced the discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine offenses from 101 to 18(1). There is perhaps one thing both supporters and critics of the 1980s drug war can agree on: the policies and laws put into place during the Just Say No era created a drug-focused political agenda that still impacts many Americans today. What do you think about this? Please share this news and scroll down to comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Top Stories Today.